Hello to Paul Wood, former MD of Spode. Paul, tell us about starting at Spode at age 15.
Yes, hello David. Um, I was really forced to. My father died when he was 23, and my mother was expecting my younger brother at the time. So we all had to go back and live in her parents' house, crammed in. But money was very tight. We were talking about just after the war, and so basically she wanted me to go and get some money in. My friends went to grammar school, but she said she couldn't afford the uniform or the travel and so on. So I went to Spode, and she was working there at the time with two of my aunts. And it's very common in the pottery industry for families to work together, and certainly going to work on the same transport or bus or whatever.
What were the choices open to other schoolboys from Stoke at the time?
Very little. I can't remember. I mean, obviously there was the mines. There was the Michelin was a big operation at the time, making tyres. But that was the easier option, and I could start immediately earning the massive sum of £2.50 a week, which came in very handy apparently.
And what was your mother doing, and what trade did you start?
There's a process called slide lithography or water slide, and it's a means of decorating glazed ware. And it's very similar to what you do with, if you make model aeroplanes, you have little decals that you put on, but these are specialised ceramic ones, and they're then fired. And she was the forewoman of the department that did that. It was relatively small at the time, but it grew to be the main department for decoration. So she was already there, and she got me the job as apprentice engraver. I was always interested in art, and that seemed to be a logical.
So what did apprentice engravers do? What was your daily daily work?
Well, the core idea was that you were trained to learn to be an engraver, which was quite a long process. But a lot of it seemed to involve sweeping up, going to fetch toast from the rest of the engravers. We had quite a large engraving establishment there, some quite old gentlemen and some younger. There were two of us as apprentices, and because it's an important role within the factory. There were about three of the highest paid jobs. One was engraving, another one was modelling, and so on. So it was a very useful job to be in if you could get it.
Was this a well-known career path? Were there many different types of apprentices at the time?
In the area, it was well known. It was very much male-dominated. There were no ladies doing it. Although in my time we did have one young lady who came to start an apprenticeship there. Yes, it was a well-known job in the area. And a lot of factories use the engraving process, but not to the same standard that Spode did.
And how did you move on from there? Did you finish your apprenticeship and become a full-time engraver?
I finished my apprenticeship. One of the things that you have to, or you get the benefit of, is you do a copper engraving, which has various techniques of engraving on it, and you can have a print of that when you've finished it, which I've got. And that was when I was about 18. But shortly after that, I was made redundant. The whole industry was going through some difficulty, and because of a lot of the patterns being converted to the aforementioned water slide, engraving became less and less of an important factor. There was always some engraving left, but it became less and less of a major requirement in the decorating process.
What decade would this have been in?
This would have been 64, 65, something like that.
And how did you move on from that particular role?
I went off-site to a factory that actually produced the decals, the water slide, for about a year and a half, and which I enjoyed. But then another job came up. My mother was still working at the factory and keeping an eye open, and another job came up, which was in the patent safe. There is a large collection of all the historical patent books. Every time a patent is introduced, it's registered in this book, given a number, or one of these books. And that was the job that was going. So I took that role. It also involved, interestingly enough for me, you were also called Samples King, and if anybody wanted a special item producing, or there was a design that had been done that needed to be followed through on the factory, I was given the job of doing that. And that was very interesting, because I literally was able to go into every function on the factory and see what was done and how it was done and so on. So very early on, mostly on the factory in those days, people didn't go into other people's areas, but I was able to. I was a nuisance to everybody, as they always made it clear, because asking for a one-off when they're trying to get on with piecework, it was something of a nuisance. But it was a great grounding in understanding the processes and how things were done.
And how did your career move on? I mean, you reached the higher echelons, but there must have been one or two roles that you were working on and doing well to reach. Was it design director?
Yes. When I was in the patent safe, the company had been acquired by the Carborundum company, and I don't know what went on in the background, but as a result of that, and one of the senior managers influencing the decision, I was moved into the design department as a junior there, basically more of a somebody would do a new design and you would have to make all the drawings so that it fitted different pieces and things like that. So you were a support artist. Then I got more into new creative designs, and at some point in that there was one of those other lucky things that happened to me in life. You get a retirement of somebody that was key, and in this case we had a role that was called product development manager. So when the designs and the creativity was done, it was passed over to an intermediate department who converted it into these decals by working with outside printers and so on. And that was the role I was given when that gentleman retired. The engravers reported to me as well in that role. So it was the first one I had that was a fairly senior or an important position.
A management role.
Position, yes. And that lasted for quite a while. But it, again, hugely useful in terms of informing me about how things were done.
And as far as your progression through to director level, was this again partly due to senior people retiring? Yes, that was again, how it worked?
Again, it's sort of, as they say, people get promoted when generals get killed, and but in my case it was just the age of the people involved. And the design director, Harold Holdway, was retiring, and I was appointed to the job.
Because he'd been there donkey's
since
years.
The 30s or something.
Yes.
He was a very influential figure, a
yes.
very large figure in the company. But quite a set of big shoes to fill. But it was somewhat unexpected in that I was still quite young at that time. I think I was 29, something like that. But there was a gentleman in the design department who was expected to. He was older than I, and he was expected to take on the role. And then I was offered the job, but he was really good about it, and there was no problem, and we always continued to work happily. So.
And some of the things that you did as design director, what are you particularly proud of that you put in place at that time?
Really, there were several things that were happening at the time. There were a few royal anniversaries and celebrations and so on. And Spode is always known for producing items for that. We actually had the Royal Warrant, so you know, to a certain extent you need to do those sort of things. It's always a pleasure to do them. But generally it was a time of, we were still owned by Carborundum, and they wanted to develop a lot of business in North America. And they went about it in a way that was very useful to me as to how not to do it later on. So we produced a lot of designs based on the fact that they went around in America and collected a plate of all the best-selling patterns to the bridal market in the US and asked us to do things like that. So we had a room full of these American designs, and we were doing a whole series of patterns that were of a similar ilk. And of course, when they got over to America, the retailers said, we've got one of those, don't need another one. So the whole thing was really forced one back to what you have to do in our industry, which is you have to do something original. And at that time it was necessary to really do things that were very different from what everybody else had. So I started to look for the niche of what is it that people... we used to have strange conversations with retailers. I always liked to go out and talk to the customers and the retailers. And we had these strange conversations about what would you want? Well, something different. How different? What is it you would like? Well, we don't know.
Yeah.
But we just know it needs to be different, which is about as much use as a chocolate teapot. But that was the sort of conversations one had. But it made me realise that you know, no, at the end of the day, nobody needed anything we made. And the retailers have also got constraints because they've got certain amount of space. They will take on things that are different to try and get more sales out of customers that they don't currently have. But of course they maintain the sales of the other companies which are doing well for them. So you have to find niches and differences. And that was when I started to look at the history of the company, really, as to what was there. Because we had 70,000 patterns registered in our pattern books over 200 years or so.
Yeah. And
enormous resource, absolutely wonderful. So although it seems to be relatively uncreative, it was a really useful thing to start to do, and producing designs which were based on archive material.
At what stage did you add the MD role to your design director role? Did that make it easier for you to do what you wanted to do?
In the meantime, I'd been made, because we'd become associated, a company was formed in association with Royal Worcester. We also had two other small companies in Longton, one called Palissy and the other one called Hammersley. And they'd been acquired by earlier owners for some expansion reasons, which I couldn't really understand because they had no relationship to our business. But I became the group design director of Royal Worcester and these other companies as well as Spode. And of course, Worcester being 70 miles away, it was up and down rather a lot. But it was very interesting because the Worcester output was very different than Spode's, although they had the same issues of needing to be what they were and very specific and different than anybody else. But they had been going through difficult times as well. So,
I mean, it would be interesting to hear about the different owners of Spode in your time at the company, because it changed hands a number of times. I mean, that has challenges in itself. But can you remember that the companies that you worked for?
Yes, the first change from the Copeland family, because the Copelands owned it for a long time, and after Spode the second died, really, but there was a lot of stability, but not much investment and so on. It was really very retrospective, I suppose. But the company wasn't doing very well for the last Copeland era. It was a difficult time for a lot of people in the industry. But the company was then sold to the Carborundum company for, in my view, I mean, they were decent folks. I mean, I didn't have a huge problem with them, but they had a rather strange logic as to why they bought Spode, and that is that grinding wheels are a form of ceramic, which was, you know, so
Well, whereabouts were they based in the US?
Manchester.
Oh, in Manchester.
Yes, they had an American, they were basically an American company, they had American distribution, but they were based in Manchester. They didn't really understand the factory, and they tried to organise the disorganisation that the factory was necessarily having. So they put a lot of machinery in and so on to try and move product through more efficiently and so on, but in fact it just didn't fit the modus of operandi of that at that time. Yeah, it was an interesting phase. But they also were there at the time of the anniversary in 1970, and they set up a museum in Niagara Falls in America and fitted it out with people from Spode to demonstrate manufacturing in America, and also bought a lot of antiques, pots and so on to display the history of the company out there. But there was a big anniversary in London as well at the Royal Academy, and that was a very nice thing, and I was involved with that purely on the basis of wrapping things up and taking it down and then collecting it. My wife and I went down to wrap everything up to have it returned, because I'd met my wife at Spode, and of course, and it just got me into antiques and the old Spode. And later on, after a run of that, the company was acquired briefly by a man called Sir John Leworthy, and this was an interesting one. Never met the gentleman. But he was into the electronics business, and Royal Worcester had a rather odd offshoot. They had a separate company which made electronics, and he was looking to develop and get into the telephone market at that time, because up until then telephones were a sort of government-controlled operation. It was private, but it was open to public manufacture then. So that's all he wanted. He only wanted the electronics division, or electronics company, and was quite happy to take that off and sell the rest on. So at that time there was concern, because when a couple of the owners came round, we had a very large collection of ceramics on the factory, old ceramics, the company collection, including the blue room. And they used to look at it and say, "Oh, I wonder what that's worth," you know, because they owned it in effect. And there was always the risk that it could be sold. In the event it wasn't, but it was always a possibility. At that time, Robert Copeland, who was retired from the company but heavily involved in the museum and all the rest of it, he went to see Sir John Leworthy and said, they persuaded him, if you sold the company, or when you sell the company, can you put I forget what you call it.
Clause.
A clause, absolutely, thank you. A clause in the sale document that says the museum collection has to be retained and protected under a trust. So we are grateful, very grateful to Robert, not about that but other things as well. But he was instrumental in doing that. So was then, if I can get the sequence right, it was London International that bought the company. They were, again, really nice people. I mean, they were super. But they were, at the end of the day, condom manufacturers. And they were the old London Rubber, although they changed their name to London International, I think. But again, an American company primarily. But they were seeing, with the pill and the rest of it, they were seeing a considerable reduction in demand for their core products. And they were looking round, they were cash, rich, but they were looking round for diversification, and dropped on Spode as Royal Worcester as a opportunity. And they just supported the business and me. I got on with them very well as design director and so on. And they sent me on a lot of training courses and so on to bring on my business knowledge and expand on that, which I found very useful, still do looking back. But then they realised what happened was AIDS came along, and suddenly their traditional core business was a raging business for them. So they then put the companies up for sale again. What happened was that the company itself, and I don't quite know how it happened, but Royal Worcester was also for sale as an independent company, and they were put together as a package for somebody to make it more substantial for them to buy. And it was set up, I think, ultimately by themselves. So we had people come in, probably supported by the banks. I wasn't really at that level, but they called the company Royal Worcester Spode, and one brand, which I always found odd, like merging Mercedes and Rolls Royce. Forgive me. In one company, it just didn't make any sense. However,
I mean, you were in charge at Royal Worcester at the same time as Spode, even though it's sort of 70 miles down the motorway.
A long and boring way.
I mean, can you sort of compare and contrast the what Royal Worcester produced in your time compared to what Spode produced? Are they so different, or I mean, how would you categorise the two different
it was
companies?
Very much a different atmosphere, but in terms of the thing we've not talked about, of course, was the other element, the other leg of Spode, which is the bone china. And bone china was a critical element and was created by Spode, the recipe for bone china, way back in the 1790s, or whatever. Briefly called it Stoke china until his son came. But Worcester used to make a very high quality bone china too. But what they also did, based on their original history, was they originally started up as a porcelain factory under Dr. Wall, and it had a secret recipe for making porcelain. Porcelain has certain qualities that other products don't, in that they're much more heat resistant. And Worcester had a big cookware porcelain production of oven to tableware, and had a famous pattern called Evesham, which had been going for years, fruit and flower pattern. And so that was it was interesting to me because the technology is quite different from either earthenware or china, and it has its own problems in terms of how to make it. But I was only design director there. I was briefly managing director at the end of my term, but for most of the time I was design director. But one of the things I could do, because I was working at Spode as well, was the first thing I did was introduce Stafford Flowers, which was a Spode pattern, as cookware at Worcester. Did new shapes and so on in the porcelain. And that was hugely successful. It went out. It's a little bit of a gold trim, so a lovely box for it. And I always remember the salesman coming back and saying, "Can you do it again?" Because it was a very large proportion of the factory's output in the first year. It was very successful.
Did it work both ways, that you could take any Royal Worcester patterns and have Spode produce them, or did it just?
No, it was because the other large element of Worcester's production was figurines, very high quality limited edition figurines and so on. So that was not something that Spode. We'd had a brief foray into it on the Carborundum, made Big Eagle or something like that. but it wasn't really part of the tradition. When the company was then sold on, and I think I'm right in the sequence, it was to a couple of gentlemen. They had a company called Derby International, and I beg your pardon, Exeter International, and they originally owned the rally bicycle. There was an American gentleman and an English guy, and they originally owned the rally bicycle, which they'd sold to an American company for considerable sum, and were looking to invest in something else. And they came along to us, and at that point I was the design director group, as I've said before, and they offered me, they did a lot of research into how the company was being run and so on, and who was involved, and they offered me the job as managing director at Spode.
What year would that have
That would
been?
be 1987, something like
Okay.
that. And it was, you know, a bolt out of the blue. But yeah, they were very supportive. But I said yes, I would. I'd take it on, but so long as you got me the absolute best accountant and finance director you could get, and a damn good production director, and so on. And we did have that at the end of the day. I was extremely lucky. The gentleman who became my finance director, or our finance director, had been the accountant to the design department at Worcester. And so I had a lot of experience with him, and he was a very smart guy. And he was just about to take up a job elsewhere when we offered him this one, and he came in. He was a great asset. And Royal Worcester were the original home for the production director, who'd had difficulties with the management there, but he'd been the production director for the whole of the Royal Worcester operations. And he came to work at Spode, and he was terrific, and he set about immediately, you know, reorganising and based on his experience. So I had a great team. The sales director was one I'd known well. He was in America, and but we persuaded him to come back and work at Spode, and he did. He was happy to come back.
So how long were Exeter International
They
in charge? Owners?
Well, basically until it finally went to...
Okay, so that was the last big change of
last big change.
ownership. Can you give us an idea of the financial fortunes of the company and the size of the workforce over your time there? I mean, I know it went down and went up, and
I think most of the industry was, you know, went in cycles and for various reasons, depending on which markets they were in. But yeah, at the time, obviously with the contraction of the engraving department and so on when I first started, but the market was relatively slack. But you always have a percentage of people. You don't necessarily need to let them go, but you normally have a percentage of people that leave in the company or move to another company and so on. It was usually about 15%. But the average for the size of the company was about 500. I reduced it considerably in my time by changing the mix of product. We used to have a large business producing whiskey flagons for Chivas, and in a way it was dominating the production. When my finance director got to grips with the business, he realised that basically you could throw a piece of clay in at one end and a pot would come out at the other end, but nobody knew how much it cost or what was really involved. And he set about, he put a computer in, or we put a computer in to manage the whole process and the whole system through the factory, of putting in individual costs for each section, each portion of the production process. So we actually knew, we could work out what margins we were genuinely getting. It was very much a guessing by God origin. And we found out that a lot of things were doing well, but the Chivas business was making very, very small margins.
Yeah.
So that, and at the same time, the people that were Chivas came back to us and said, we want a price reduction and so on. So it was a big decision because they were quite a large proportion of the business. But I decided we should say goodbye. And along with that was a whole stream of people all through the factory that were dedicated purely to the production of that one product. And so that caused a considerable reduction in the workforce.
So if you started at 500 employees?
It was about 50 people. We finished up with about 450.
Okay, well that's, in the scheme of things, not a big
Oh, it wasn't enormous.
reduction. I mean, that presumably accounts were filed at Company's House and things. What sort of turnover was the company doing in the period?
The figures I can remember were something like 11 million turnover, but I could well be wrong. It's a long time ago, and I wasn't really involved with that. My real involvement was improving the volume of throughput through the factory, with my production director improving the efficiency of the business. And you know, at the end of the day, you get a consequence of that, which is an improvement overall.
Yeah.
So rather than worry about what we were doing, I left it to the finance director to juggle the realities. I soon learned the difference between cash flow and profit, which is very considerable and very important. If you can have it's the old joke, isn't it? You know, if we're going to do a profit report this year, and the accountant would say what numbers you want it to be, but cash is cash, and if you're not getting your cash flow in, you can't pay the wages.
And I understand that you had some responsibility for setting up the what's now known as the Spode Blue Room.
It's a very, to me, an interesting story. We had a very large section of our business that was Christmas tree. We had an American company, distribution company, and Christmas tree, which was designed by Holdway in 1933, had grown from a single into a full dinner service and so on, and it was a very, very successful pattern in America. But it was an odd one in that, in terms of improving the flow through, Christmas tree was filling the factory for the first 6 months of the year, because what you had to do was to get it all made and out into the warehouse in America by July, and then it would be redistributed into the retail stores by Christmas. So what that meant was you had a very, very busy factory for 6 months, or decorating department for 6 months, and then suddenly they were on short time, and you know, you really needed to be looking for work to fill a gap. And a couple of things happened. I'd got the engravers where I wasn't able to keep them very busy on one hand, and I was getting concerned that I might have to be laying them off, which, as an ex-engraver myself, I found that a very troubling possibility, but you have to be realistic. And I was scratching my head about what could we put in that would fill that gap, the post-Christmas tree gap. And just puzzling over it, I went to visit, just to get my mind off it, I went to visit an old friend of mine who was the managing director of Denby, and had a nice visit and went round his factory and all that stuff. And he just as we were leaving, he dropped a comment saying, "I'm surprised you don't do more with that blue stuff."
Yeah.
And well, I'd looked at that because we already had 3 dinnerware patterns, yeah. Blue Italian being the most important one. So I couldn't see the logic of competing with ourselves by doing another blue dinnerware pattern. But in the meantime, separately, I always bought fashion magazines and home decor magazines and so on to see what was coming through. And I was realising there are underlying changes that happen in the fashion side, and one of the bigger ones was the fashion was changing from Scandinavian simplicity in the 70s into the sort of manor house, highly decorated scene, and Laura Ashley was a big example of that. And I started to see pictures of the movement away from the dining room into the kitchen. People started to show more photographs of the centre of the home being the kitchen, and some big grand kitchens, wonderful. But in the background there were collections of blue on Welsh dresses, blue plates, and I'm sitting there going, I've got dozens of these in the archive. If that's a collectible, why can't we do something that means it's an instant purchase? You don't have to go around collecting different old plates. So I went back to the engravers and I had them produce 6 different designs, because the process was different from. I couldn't use the antique engravings because they were, they were part of the collection. So I had them renewed. The engravers loved it because they got these, suddenly they get the teeth into something. And there were 6 different plates, and I had them put in a box. And the Blue Room was an obvious name to me, to the Blue Room collection. And we put them out. It cost a lot of money to have those 6 engraving, because each one would take about 6 weeks to engrave. So there was quite a delay between the idea and the execution. But that worked tremendously well. So immediately I was away and looking for. We had all the old moulds and the shapes and pieces and things, and I started to introduce things on a yearly basis, and it just grew and grew and grew, and it was immensely successful. And judging by how much of the stuff you still see on eBay and so on, we got a lot of it out. I remember one thing in particular we did a series of spice jars and put the names on and all sort of thing. And the factory was filled with them. I mean,
Paul Wood, thank you very much. Paul went on to be appointed a Deputy Lieutenant for Staffordshire before retiring aged 60. Thanks to Paul for his time and hospitality. This is the first of a number of clips from this interview. Look out for more. Did you enjoy this? Would you like to see further interviews? Who would you like to hear from? Please add a comment below.